It began not with war nor rebellion, but with a vision of order, of strength, of a future forged by the will of one man. He was not a primarch, not a high lord, but his name would be etched into the annals of imperial history with fire and blood. His name was Lufgt Huron, and he would come to be known as the Tyrant of Badab. At the dawn of the 41st Millennium, the Maelstrom Zone, an unstable region of space racked by warp storms and xenos raids, was a volatile frontier. Within it, the Badab sector stood as a buffer between imperial space and the chaos beyond. It was here that Huron rose to prominence, chapter master of the Astral Claws, a once proud successor of the Tiger Claws, whose line had nearly been lost to time. Under Huron, the Astral Claws were reborn, not as guardians, but as conquerors. The official appointment of the Astral Claws as Wardens of the Maelstrom in 901 M41 granted them jurisdiction over the sector's defense, but Huron took the title and made it into a throne. He fortified Badab Primaris, transforming its capital into the Palace of Thorns, a sprawling bastion of adamantium and obsidian steel. He reorganized his chapter, reinforcing its numbers through secretive recruitment and questionable means. And he extended his reach over the entire sector, incorporating several lesser worlds into what he declared to be the Tyrant's dominion. To his allies and loyal followers, Huron was a savior. He brought stability to a region plagued by pirates, heretics, and xenos filth. Trade routes once lost were reopened. Hive cities once besieged were secured. Planets forgotten by the Administratum hailed him as a warlord who delivered results where the Imperium offered only bureaucracy. His arm was iron, his will absolute, and his authority unchallenged. But to the eyes of the Imperium, something darker was stirring. The Astral Claws no longer answered inquiries from Segmentum Command. The tithes of gene seed required from every chapter as a sacred obligation ceased arriving at the repositories of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Civilian administrations across the Maelstrom began to report the presence of armed enforcers not under their jurisdiction, soldiers bearing the sigil of the Tyrant's Legion, a military force raised and commanded solely by Huron. Then came the edicts. Huron issued formal decrees to the Administratum, asserting that the Badab sector's resources would no longer be subject to arbitrary off-world requisition. He claimed the tithes endangered the Maelstrom's security, and that any attempt to enforce them would be considered an act of aggression. He insisted that his rule was sanctioned by necessity, and that the Astral Claws' autonomy was essential to safeguarding Imperial citizens in the region. The High Lords of Terra did not respond immediately. Some viewed Huron as a useful buffer, others as an arrogant upstart. The sector's relative prosperity under his command gave pause to those who feared destabilization. But within the halls of the Inquisition, the seeds of concern took root. Reports trickled in, whispers of increased recruitment beyond codex limits, of gene seed experimentation, of secret shipyards buried beneath the surface of Badab's moons. Huron was building something large and something hidden. In 904 M41, an incident ignited the powder keg. An Imperial tithe fleet arrived at Badab, seeking to audit the missing resources and extract overdue obligations. Huron ordered the fleet destroyed. With a single command, Imperial ships were incinerated in low orbit, their crews obliterated without warning. There were no survivors, no negotiations, only silence followed by fire. The massacre shocked the Segmentum authorities. To the Inquisition, it was an act of open rebellion. To Huron, it was preemptive defense. He claimed the fleet had threatened planetary security, that their demands would destabilize the region and expose the Maelstrom to invasion. He declared that the Imperium's bureaucracy had failed the people of Badab and that the Astral Claws would no longer be beholden to it. And so he forged the Articles of Just Secession. It was a calculated document, one that asserted the right of Astartes chapters to act in the Emperor's name without interference from the Adeptus Terra. Huron summoned his closest allies, the Mantis Warriors and the Lamenters, both chapters with their own reasons to resent the Imperium's chains. Together they swore to uphold the Maelstrom Warden's independence, to form a bulwark against disorder without constraint. But within the subtext of these declarations, a darker ambition pulsed. Huron did not seek mere independence. He sought dominion. What began as defiance was evolving into sedition. His vision of a united Maelstrom under his rule had no place for Terra's commands or tithes. He had seized the stars and crowned himself their king. Within the fortified vaults of the Palace of Thorns, Huron prepared. He expanded his manufactorums, refitted ancient vessels, and began to fabricate war gear in numbers that exceeded any defensive mandate. His tyrant's legions swelled with soldiers conscripted from worlds under his dominion, PDFs, mercenaries, former criminals, all forged into a brutal force loyal only to him. The Astral Claws, once noble defenders, became enforcers of his will. Their heraldry grew darker, their tactics more ruthless, their loyalty absolute. From the cold corridors of Segmentum Command came the order. Huron must answer for his crimes, but by then it was too late. The Tyrant of Badab had thrown down his gauntlet. He had declared himself not against the Emperor, but against the Imperium itself, and in doing so he lit the flame that would become the Badab War. This was no ordinary rebellion. It was not born of heresy, nor spawned by chaos. It was something more insidious. A war of principle, of pride, of control. The war of a man who believed he knew better than those who ruled from Terra. Lufgt Huron believed himself a hero, a protector, a sovereign. The Imperium would remember him as a traitor, and the stars would burn in the name of his ambition. The tyrant's words echoed through the void, but it was his actions that would draw the Imperium's gaze. Even before the first blade was drawn, the signs of unraveling loyalty could be traced like cracks across a mirror. To those within the Astral Claws, it was a time of purpose, a moment when they stood ready to forge a new path through the decay and incompetence of the wider Imperium. But to those outside the Badab sector, those cracks were widening into a schism no loyal servant of the throne could ignore. After the Tithe Fleet's destruction, the heavens above Badab were no longer a political border. They were a line drawn in blood. Yet still the High Lords hesitated. The Adeptus Terra, ancient and slow to move, debated. The Administratum demanded restitution. The Adeptus Mechanicus, stung by the loss of gene seed and forbidden from their due, pressed for action. The Ordo Hereticus watched quietly, sending agents whose names never made it into official ledgers. And amidst it all, the Astartes of other chapters, brothers of the gene, spread across the stars, waited with unease. Within the Maelstrom Zone, the mood was shifting. Huron had not acted in isolation. The secession was no spontaneous explosion. It was a slow erosion of trust, built on years of resentment and suspicion. Take the Mantis Warriors, for example. They had fought ceaselessly along the Maelstrom's rim, often alone and undersupplied. Though fiercely loyal to the Emperor, they had grown disillusioned with the bureaucracy that denied them reinforcements, equipment, and recognition. When Huron summoned their chapter master, Sartak, to the Palace of Thorns, the decision he faced was not one of betrayal, but of practicality. Join the tyrant's vision of a secure, self-governed maelstrom, or continue to bleed on distant rocks with nothing but a data slate and silence from Terra to show for it. Sartak chose to stand with Huron. The Lamenters were harder to turn. This was a chapter cursed not by heresy, but by history. Every campaign they joined, every battle they fought, seemed to end in loss, disgrace, or tragedy. Their penitent nature, born from past affiliations with the damned legions, cast long shadows over their reputation. Still, they strove for redemption, throwing themselves into battle after battle in the hope of restoring their honor. But redemption proved elusive. When Huron approached them, he did not speak of rebellion. He spoke of fairness, of a future where chapters like the Lamenters could prove their worth free from suspicion. He promised a new order, where loyalty was measured in blood, not bureaucracy. And for the Lamenters, weary of suspicion and slander, that promise resonated like a bell struck in the heart of a monastery. They too sided with the Wardens. Thus the triumvirate was forged, the Astral Claws, the Mantis Warriors, and the Lamenters. Together they signed the Articles of Just Secession, a document unlike any other in recent Imperial history. The language within was carefully constructed, the tone measured. It did not reject the Emperor. It did not denounce the Imperium. It merely questioned its function. It declared that in the Maelstrom Zone, the needs of war demanded freedom of operation, unchained by red tape and distant decrees. And yet, beneath that language was the sting of defiance. The document was disseminated across the sector. Printed in High Gothic, copies were delivered to Segmentum officials, to nearby chapter keeps, to the scribes of the Adeptus Terra. Some were appalled, others intrigued. Still others, particularly in war-torn or neglected regions of the Imperium, saw in it a glimmer of dangerous hope, that perhaps the Astartes could govern themselves more effectively than the lumbering corpse of imperial bureaucracy. The High Lords had no such illusions. To them, the articles were treason wrapped in parchment. But reaction, once again, was not immediate. The Imperium is vast. Its response must be measured. And though the banners of rebellion were being quietly unfurled, the full extent of the tyrant's preparations remained cloaked in secrecy. For Lufgt Huron, this breathing space was invaluable. Within the depths of the Badab system, great foundries were awakened. Deep within the moons orbiting Badab Primaris, production facilities once hidden for centuries came alive with the hiss of servitors and the clang of automata. Power armor was forged in secret, bolt guns assembled in lines of silence and smoke. Not all of it bore the markings of the Astral Claws. Some sets, curiously, bore the heraldry of the Tiger Claws, a chapter declared lost long ago. But Huron was a student of history, and from the ashes of the past, he was constructing a new force. He called it the Tyrant's Legion. This was no ordinary military. It was a hybrid, a melding of chapter serfs, PDF conscripts, private mercenaries, and rogue tech priests willing to trade compliance for protection. Though undisciplined by Astartes standards, it was numerous, brutal, and fanatically loyal to Huron. Unlike traditional Astartes forces, the Legion could hold garrisons, conduct siege warfare, and police entire systems without drawing on scarce space marine strength. By the time the Inquisition uncovered fragments of these developments, it was already too late to contain them quietly. In 903 M41, a Red Scorpion's scout patrol intercepted a transmission meant for a relay beacon near the Androkin belt. The message was encoded using an archaic cipher only used by the Astartes and revealed, in chilling clarity, orders for a naval blockade to be established in the Iron Stars, orders signed by Huron and countersigned by Sartak of the Mantis Warriors. The Maelstrom Zone was no longer operating under Imperial rule. The implications were catastrophic. Trade routes had already begun to shift away from sanctioned paths. Tithes were delayed, sometimes vanishing entirely. Several forge worlds supplying the region began to experience disruptions. Independent rogue traders, fearing piracy, refused to travel near Badab-held sectors without exorbitant fees. And worst of all, Whispers began to circulate that Huron's forces were recruiting beyond their limits, that the Codex Astartes was being abandoned in favor of something darker, more efficient. The Inquisition, always watchful for heresy, began compiling a case. Still, no direct action had yet been taken. It was the destruction of the Second Tithe Fleet that ended the debate. In early 904 M41, another administratum delegation, escorted by a heavily armed task force of battle fleet Maelstrom vessels, approached Badab. They came not to negotiate, but to compel. The response was immediate and absolute. Not a single ship returned. The entire convoy was annihilated above the orbit of Badab Secundus. Data cores recovered later by loyalist agents confirmed the final transmission. Static, then a voice, the unmistakable growl of Lufgt Huron declaring, "The Maelstrom answers to no chain but the Emperor's. But those who serve the throne know, defiance to the Imperium is defiance to the Emperor." That single broadcast transformed suspicion into certainty. No longer was the tyrant's defiance a matter of policy. It was now a matter of war. Even as the ashes of the Second Fleet cooled, the Lords of Terra signed the decree of sanction. The Badab sector was to be purged of its disobedience. Loyal Astartes chapters were to be summoned. War was coming. And yet, for all his fire and fury, Huron Blackheart, the name he would soon take, did not flinch. He had known this day would come. He had prepared for it. It was in the lightless reaches beyond the Endymion cluster that the first blood was drawn. The void was quiet. Not the sacred silence of a shrine, but the dangerous kind, still, expectant, too calm. The Firehawks, proud sons of the Ebon Flame, had entered the Maelstrom's periphery with engines lit and banners unfurled, their prows carved like spears of vengeance. It was a task they had accepted with righteous zeal, to investigate the accusations of secession, to bring the light of imperial truth to a region now clouded by shadows. They had not expected war. Not yet. Their arrival was meant as deterrence, a signal. But the Firehawks did not ask permission when they stepped into a new war zone, and they did not wait for diplomacy. Their orders were simple: enforce compliance, confirm loyal service, and return order to the region by any means necessary. It was a script they had followed on 100 other worlds. The Mantis warriors, however, had written a new play entirely. As the strike cruiser Red Harbinger emerged from the warp, the stars above Endymion's fourth planet shimmered with falsity. The beacon frequencies were wrong, slightly skewed. Defensive arrays glinted off asteroids that shouldn't have been there, and nestled within the orbiting debris, dormant ships lay coiled like waiting serpents. At first, the Firehawks attempted standard procedure. Vox hails were sent, encrypted in High Gothic. They announced their presence, their allegiance to Terra, and demanded passage for inspection. What answered was silence. Then a low-frequency burst, crude, direct, not a refusal, not a welcome. Just one word, transmitted in binaric echo. Leave. Captain Cord Bale, the commander of the Firehawk strike group, did not comply. He ordered his ships into formation, drop pods primed, gun decks readied. No one challenged a decree from the High Lords of Terra, not in the name of pride or paranoia. The Firehawks believed themselves righteous, and they had every reason to, until the stars exploded around them. From the dark, mantis pattern interceptors streaked forward like splinters of green lightning. Their attack was surgical, communications first, then navigation, then the engine cores. They didn't want to destroy the Red Harbinger, not completely. They wanted it crippled, burning, screaming, gasping for help that would never come. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. As Firehawk's gunships scrambled to respond, the Mantis warriors unleashed a storm of fire from weapon platforms hidden among the asteroid field. Their mastery of ambush tactics, refined through years of harassing orc warbands and raiding pirate dens, was now turned against fellow Astartes. The Red Harbinger's escort frigate was ripped in half by a torpedo barrage before it could return fire. On the main cruiser's bridge, Bale ordered a counterattack, but it was already too late. Boarding torpedoes slammed into the hull. Breach alarms screamed through the corridors. Void shields flickered, then fell. The battle was over before the Firehawks had even fired a full salvo. Inside the ship, what followed was chaos. The Mantis warriors moved like predators in a labyrinth. They did not bellow challenges. They did not issue demands. They hunted. Room by room, deck by deck, they carved their way through the strike cruiser. Plasma cutters hissed through bulkheads. Bolt rounds detonated in confined spaces. Even hardened Firehawks veterans, trained in brutal Void War boarding drills, found themselves overwhelmed. The last signal received from the Red Harbinger was a garbled scream drowned in static. An image accompanied it, flickering vid capture of green-armored shapes advancing through smoke, and the Firehawks' chapter banner aflame at their feet. The message reached Terra with the weight of a thunderclap. This was no accident. This was no misunderstanding. This was civil war. Back on Badab Primaris, Huron stood before the inner conclave of the Astral Claws. Reports streamed in. Debris fields of Firehawks ships catalogued. Prisoners taken. Genetic samples confirmed. The Mantis warriors had performed perfectly, and more importantly, the line had been crossed. The Imperium would now retaliate. But that was exactly what Huron had planned for. With the first strike, the war was no longer theoretical. It had a body count, and once blood was drawn, there could be no reconciliation. His enemies had come too far, and his allies had invested too much. Retreat would mean disgrace, even death. And so the gears began to turn. The Palace of Thorns echoed with the hammering of fresh war steel. Communications were dispatched to Sartak of the Mantis warriors, to Malakim Foros of the Lamenters, and to Thulsa Kane of the Executioners. Each carried a simple message. The Imperium is coming. Stand your ground, steel your blade, and be ready to spill the blood of your brothers. Meanwhile, across the stars, the High Lords held council. The destruction of the Firehawks cruiser could not be ignored, neither could the prior destruction of the two Tithe fleets. The slow insubordination had escalated into open bloodshed, and now an Astartes chapter had suffered catastrophic losses at the hands of their kin. The War Council demanded action. They issued the Edict of Censure. It named Lufgt Huron and the Astral Claws as renegades, their status within the Imperium suspended pending judgment. The Mantis warriors and Lamenters, by association and by action, were to be considered allies of the rebellion unless they formally renounced Huron's secession. But it was too late. In the Badab sector, the war had already begun to bloom like a black flower. Within weeks, new fleets were mobilized. The Red Scorpions were the first to respond. Known for their fanatical devotion to protocol and the Codex Astartes, they viewed Huron's defiance as an abomination. Their chapter master, Varant Ortis, pledged the full might of their strike forces to the cleansing of Badab. The Salamanders followed next, their hearts burning with justice. They had long despised those who abused power over mortals, and Huron's Tyrants' Legion, press-ganged and brutal, was an affront to everything they stood for. Then came the Marines Errant, the Raptors, and the Nova Marines, some drawn by duty, others by rivalry, and still others simply by the need to stem what could become a sector-wide contagion of rebellion. The Loyalists had begun to gather. The first shots had been fired, and somewhere in the heart of the storm, Huron smiled. The galaxy had finally answered his challenge. The Badab War had truly begun. The first flames of rebellion had licked the stars, and now they spread hungrily to the world of Sagan III. While the Imperium reeled from the ambush of the Red Harbinger, Lufgt Huron wasted no time. His war was not one of idle defiance. It was a calculated cascade. If the Imperium sought to tighten the noose, he would force it to wrap around its own neck. And the key to that next move lay with Sagan III, a world nestled at the edge of the Endymion cluster, where warp currents turned treacherous and Imperial presence had always been fleeting. Sagan was no paradise. Its surface was wind-scoured rock and jagged mountains, broken only by scattered hive spires clinging to cliffside craters. But beneath that bleak skin lay a secret: deep mineral veins rich in adamantium, rare promethium wells, and more importantly, ancient data caches from the Great Crusade, buried and forgotten beneath kilometers of hardened strata. Huron had known this for years. In secret, he had fortified Sagan III, its cities bolstered by void shield generators, its crust riddled with bunkers and arcologies. What was once a minor mining colony had become a bastion. The Astral Claws moved quietly, stationing veterans in subterranean redoubts and constructing macro-battery installations on orbital ridgelines. Entire regiments of the Tyrant's Legion, mortal men indoctrinated with brutal discipline, were embedded there, equipped with mass-produced gear from Badab's forges. And when war finally erupted, Huron made his play. He ordered the full seizure of Sagan III, declaring it a strategic defensive asset of the Secessionist cause. It was a provocation that could not be ignored. The Loyalist response came swiftly. Commander Varant Ortis of the Red Scorpions was not a man given to hesitation. Having recently assumed campaign command, he recognized the strategic threat of Sagan immediately. The world sat near critical warp routes into the Maelstrom Zone. If left in enemy hands, it would serve as a staging ground for raids, a resupply node, and perhaps worst of all, a propaganda beacon that the Secessionists were too entrenched to uproot. He deployed a strike force drawn from the Red Scorpions, supported by Nova Marines, Fire Angels, and a detachment of the Marines Errant. Collectively, they assembled a fleet large enough to contest the skies, and more than sufficient to punch through a typical planetary defense. But Sagan was no typical target. The approach was contested from the first. As the Loyalist fleet exited the warp, they were greeted not by silence, but by a wall of fire. Anti-ship batteries on the surface of Sagan's moons opened up immediately. Bright trails of ion fire lanced through the void, forcing the Red Scorpion's vanguard to break formation. Automated defense satellites, thought inactive, suddenly lit the dark like miniature suns, hurling macro shells across the star field. It was clear that Huron had anticipated this move and prepared for it long in advance. For 3 full days, Void War raged in Sagan's orbit. Strike cruisers danced between fields of debris and rotating mines. Thunderhawks, normally reserved for troop deployment, were pressed into ship-to-ship combat, strafing enemy destroyers as escort vessels unleashed broadsides in tight formations. The Red Scorpion's flagship, Tertius Victor, took multiple hits to its dorsal plating, but continued to lead the advance. Captain Adrastus of the Nova Marines spearheaded a dangerous maneuver around the planet's dark side, drawing fire away from the main fleet and forcing the Secessionists to reposition. Eventually, orbital supremacy was achieved, barely. The cost had been high, a full third of the Loyalist escorts destroyed or crippled, and multiple boarding actions required just to neutralize the defensive grid. But that was merely the beginning. With the skies cleared, the Red Scorpions descended to the surface. Drop pods rained like meteors, their hulls glowing red-hot as they tore through Sagan's upper atmosphere. Thunderhawks followed in tight formation, deploying squads directly into combat zones. The Secessionists, well prepared, had entrenched themselves in layered defenses across the northern continent. It was here that the Loyalists first encountered the true extent of Huron's creation, the Tyrant's Legion. These were not Astartes. They were mortal, men and women drawn from conquered worlds, press-ganged from criminal gangs, promised glory or redemption. Many were barely trained, wearing half-plates scavenged from Mechanicus depots. But what they lacked in discipline, they made up for in numbers, and they fought with the desperation of those who knew failure meant death. Behind them, the Astral Claws loomed like demigods. Clad in gunmetal and silver, their leaders directed the battle like conductors. They did not waste their strength on attrition. They struck only when the lines faltered, when loyalist squads overextended, or when a breach seemed inevitable. Then they descended with fury, cracking open lines, smashing squads with brutal, coordinated violence. The Red Scorpions, as ever, answered with precision. Veterans of countless Codex-sanctioned campaigns, their formations adapted quickly. Tactical squads rotated methodically, heavy weapons suppressing strong points while assault squads flanked. Where mortals faltered, the Astartes pressed on. Captain Ardias, noted for his cold ruthlessness, ordered a scorched earth maneuver through Sector Vargo, collapsing an entire city block to deny the enemy a key ammunition depot. The resulting firestorm burned for hours. Still, the defenders held. Beneath the ruined cities, the Secessionists had dug deep. Entire hab levels were repurposed as kill boxes. Access tunnels were flooded with chemical traps. Vox traffic indicated that at least 3 Astral Claw apothecaries were operating within the lower levels, harvesting the genocide of the fallen, not just their own, but of the Loyalists too. The implication was chilling. Huron was stockpiling gene stock, preparing not just for war, but for rebirth. The breaking point came not from above, but from within. After nearly 2 weeks of brutal siege warfare, Red Scorpion's tech marines uncovered an encrypted signal emanating from deep beneath Hive Arxad, a fortified district long thought abandoned. The signal revealed a hidden rail network connecting multiple strongpoints across the city, used by Secessionist elite to bypass front lines and resupply hidden bunkers. Ortiz acted immediately. He deployed a surgical strike team comprised of Red Scorpions, Stern Guard, and Nova Marines veterans, supported by Fire Angels flamers. Their mission: infiltrate the network, destroy the central junction, and cripple the Tyrant's ability to reinforce. The fighting in those tunnels would become legend. The team moved through the dark like shadows, but the defenders knew the ground better. Every corner was booby-trapped, every bulkhead a potential ambush. Flamers lit the way, cleansing alcoves with roaring gouts of fire. Bolter reports echoed through metal corridors. In close quarters, the fighting devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Chainswords whined, armor cracked, blood painted the walls. Eventually, they reached the core. The demolitions were set. The charges blew, collapsing the junction and burying entire wings of the Tyrant's Legion in fire and rubble. In the chaos that followed, Loyalist forces surged forward across the surface, capitalizing on the confusion, and Sagan III began to fall. In the end, it was not a clean victory. Astartes do not retreat lightly, but the Astral Claws withdrew under cover of orbital fire, taking with them dozens of stolen genocide containers and several high-ranking commanders. What they left behind was a ruined world, charred and blood-soaked, with hive cities reduced to craters and the Loyalist banners planted atop smoldering ruins. Yet for all their pain, the Loyalists had seized something vital. Sagan III was no longer a fortress. It was a beachhead. From here, the Imperium could strike deeper into the Maelstrom, and for the first time since the war began, Huron felt the breath of the throne upon his neck. The tyrant had drawn first blood, but now the Imperium had answered, and the fires of Badab burned hotter still. Far from the charred battlefields of Sagan, in the gilded spires of Carthan, war still felt like rumor. The Carthan Trade Confederacy was no stranger to conflict. It had seen 1,000 feuds and 100 economic skirmishes, but always from behind its great void gates and chartered neutrality. A coalition of merchant princes, rogue dynasts, and powerful guild families, the Confederacy had long walked the razor's edge between commerce and survival. For centuries, they played their dangerous game well, trading with imperial worlds, plying routes around the Maelstrom, and paying their dues to Terra with a gilded smile. But when Lufgt Huron declared secession, the Confederacy found itself staring into a storm it had no charter for. At first, the reaction was disbelief, then panic. The Confederacy had deep investments in the Maelstrom Zone, mining rights on Galen 6, orbital shipyards near Tranquility, indentured manufactorums on Cressida. All of these fell under Huron's shadow when the Astral Claws closed their borders. As the Secessionist fleets began seizing merchant convoys and rerouting trade through Badab-controlled systems, the economic stranglehold became suffocating. Carthan begged the Segmentum authorities for intervention, but the Imperium was already moving slowly, methodically, with the gears of war grinding into motion far away. Faced with inaction, the Confederacy took matters into its own hands. They turned to the Marines Errant, a fleet-based chapter of noble traditions. The Marines Errant had long-standing ties with the Confederacy, both diplomatic and strategic. They had escorted trade missions through the Maelstrom in centuries past and maintained a bond of trust with Carthan's ruling families. It was a bond soon to be betrayed. In 905 M41, a Carthan tithe fleet, protected by 3 strike vessels of the Marines Errant, entered contested space near the mining world of Bellerophon's Fall. Their goal was simple: extract personnel, recover vital cargo, and re-establish control over trade lanes that Huron's forces had seized months earlier. But they never made it back. The first indication of disaster came not from astropaths, but from the silence. Entire Vox channels went dark. A second fleet was dispatched to investigate. What they found was a graveyard. Wreckage littered the stars like frozen bones, torn hulls, drifting containers, smashed escape pods. The Marines Errant cruiser Valiant Duty had been cracked in two by concentrated lance fire. Lifeboats had been incinerated mid-deployment. The debris told the tale of overwhelming force, and yet no evidence of the enemy was left behind. The attackers had vanished into the void, but not without leaving a message. Among the wreckage was a single escape pod, left untouched. Within, a crewman had been preserved, barely alive, cradling a Vox recorder with bloodied hands. His mind was broken, shattered by what he had seen, but one phrase played over and over in the recorder's memory spool: executioners. They came from nowhere. They never spoke. They never stopped. The Executioners chapter had entered the war, a grim and reclusive brotherhood descended from the lineage of Rogel Dorn. The Executioners were known for their feudal traditions, honor duels, and brutal efficiency in war. Their chapter culture revolved around oaths and blood debts, and once a vow was made, it was kept unto death. Centuries earlier, the Astral Claws had aided the Executioners during a dire campaign against the Hrud. In return, Huron had quietly invoked the ancient debt. Now they had answered, and their arrival marked a deadly escalation. The Carthan Confederacy reeled from the loss, its greatest trade fleet annihilated, its allies dead in the void, its pride shattered. But Huron was not finished. Weeks after the massacre, the Confederacy learned that their former installations in the Maelstrom had been seized and restructured by the Tyrant's Legion. The vital forge platforms in orbit above Cressida had been repurposed into weapons manufactorums. Their stockpiled promethium had vanished, and worst of all, they discovered that their own people, the survivors of outposts and transport ships, had not been repatriated. They had been absorbed. Reports filtered in of entire labor populations rebranded under the Tyrant's Legion, now wearing the sigil of Badab, laboring under the Astral Claws in gunmetal gray uniforms. It was conquest not just of land or space, but of economy, of identity. Huron had weaponized the very logistics that once fed the Confederacy's wealth, and in response, Carthan bared its teeth. It was no small feat to assemble a private war fleet, but the merchant princes were not without power. Vast fortunes were liquidated, contracts were called in, black market routes opened once more. Across the border worlds, rogue Mechanicus factions were bribed to supply macro cannons and void shield projectors. From Varkos and Vendighast came mercenary fleets and sanctioned pirates, and above all, Carthan put its full weight behind its final vengeance, the formation of the Carthan Coalition Armada. Dozens of vessels, including converted cargo haulers fitted with prow lances, frigates retrofitted with cyclonic torpedoes, and a handful of rare pre-heresy cruisers recovered from mothballs, formed the spear point. At their core was a rebuilt detachment of the Marines Errant, reinforced by their reserve companies and supported by loyalist Navy assets. Their target, the Endymion cluster. Their objective, break the Secessionist blockade and remind the Maelstrom that Carthan could not be bled without consequence. It would prove their last mistake. The trap was already laid. Huron had anticipated the retaliation. His forward scouts, guided by Mantis warriors in stealth pattern strike craft, tracked the Carthan fleet as it mustered. By the time the Armada translated into the Endymion system, the Secessionists had already prepared their response. The battle began at the edge of the system, harmless-looking debris fields masking gravitic mines and dormant torpedo tubes. Within minutes, 2 Carthan escorts were gutted. Then came the boarding ships, Astral Claws strike cruisers with silent engines, disgorging Terminator squads into the flanks of the Armada's formation. From the shadows, the executioners struck again. Unlike the previous massacre, this time they brought their full strength, battle barge Night Hag, escorted by 5 strike cruisers and nearly 300 Astartes. They did not broadcast their arrival. They did not seek parley. They arrived in silence, and then they descended. Carthan ships died by the dozen. Boarding torpedoes tore into command decks, chain axes shattered bulkheads. The executioners moved in coordinated packs, cleaving their way through crew and soldier alike. Their attack was not indiscriminate, it was surgical. They sought out command staff, leadership nodes, bridge officers. Without guidance, the fleet collapsed into chaos. The Marines Errant fought bravely. Captain Varkane rallied his forces aboard the Resolve's Oath, personally leading the defense of the Central Core. But the Astral Claws broke through, and in a final act of defiance, Varkane ordered a self-destruct sequence to deny the enemy his vessel. The flash could be seen across the void. When the battle ended, the stars were empty once more. Of the Carthan Armada, barely a handful of ships limped away. Over 2,000 Carthan personnel were taken alive and distributed among secessionist installations as forced labor. The Marines' errant survivors were publicly humiliated, paraded before their dead ships, then executed or imprisoned. It was a statement of power, one no scribe in Carthan would ever forget. In the aftermath, the Carthan Confederacy collapsed inward. The guild lords turned on one another. Riots flared. Trade routes evaporated overnight. What little remained of their fleets was recalled to protect homeworlds from the expected reprisal. But the blow never came. Huron had made his point. The Confederacy had tried to play at war. Now it knew what real war looked like. For the Imperium, the loss was staggering. The High Lords had watched the events unfold from afar. With every report, with every image of burning vessels and massacred Marines, the slow-burning fury of the throne ignited. The Secessionists were no longer a political problem. They were a stain, and that stain would soon be met with fire. The Maelstrom was no longer a sector in rebellion. It was a battlefield, and the fires of retribution had just begun to stir. War in the Maelstrom had become a beast, unshackled, ravenous, sprawling, and far beyond anyone's control. The stars of the Badab sector now glowed red with ship fire, their surfaces cratered with the fury of orbital bombardments and the boots of space marines marching through ash. The Carthan Confederacy had been gutted. Sagan III had fallen to the Emperor's loyal sons. But it was still not enough. Lufgt Huron remained enthroned on Badab Primaris, unbowed, unbroken, and, most damning of all, still defiant. It was time, then, for a champion to bring order to the flames. From the void docks of New Rin's world to the glimmering bastions of Karalak's Reach, one name was spoken with reverence and fear. Tyrant Ortiz, master of the Red Scorpions. Clad in black and gold plate that shimmered with sigils of purity and codex sanction, Ortiz was not simply a commander. He was a living execution of doctrine, a zealot for order, a warrior forged in the belief that deviation from the Codex Astartes was heresy in its own right. For him, Lufgt Huron's rebellion was more than a betrayal. It was a blasphemy, and it would not go unpunished. With the Imperium's fragmented fleets scattered and bloodied after the Carthan debacle, Ortiz petitioned the lords of Segmentum Tempestus for the right to assume full strategic control of the campaign. He did not request, he demanded. And after reviewing the wreckage of Sagan, the obliteration of the Carthan armada, and the chilling silence coming from the Lamenters and Mantis warriors, the lords agreed. In 906 M41, Tyrant Ortiz was appointed High Commander of the Maelstrom Theater. His first decree was simple: destroy the Secessionist strongholds in the Vianaya cluster. Vianaya was no fortress world. It lacked the imposing black towers of Badab Primaris, the twisted metal warrens of Sagan III, or the void-shrouded traps of Endymion. It was, at first glance, a network of modest industrial colonies, strung together by fragile warp lanes and half-forgotten defense grids. But it held something Huron needed desperately: logistics. Promethium silos, orbital relay stations, bulk cargo transfer platforms, and Vox beacon arrays were scattered across its 7 inhabited moons and gas-harvesting rings. More importantly, it served as a buffer, shielding the inner systems of the Maelstrom from direct Imperial incursion. Without it, Huron's dominion would be exposed, and Ortiz knew this. So he came for it like a thunderbolt. The assault began with silence. No grand declarations, no calls for surrender, no slow-burning buildup. The Red Scorpions fleet, newly reinforced with elements of the Fire Angels, Nova Marines, and remnants of the Marines Errant, translated into the Vianaya system with precision honed through decades of warfare. Each target had already been chosen: the comms relays of Vianaya Delta, the macro yard over Pithris 5, the defense bastion on Moon 3, and the main orbital foundries on Glauer Prime. Simultaneously, they struck. Thunderhawks screamed down through Vianaya's smog-choked skies, squads of Scorpions deployed in lockstep, clearing platforms with brutal economy. No building was left standing, no resistance was tolerated. At the command of Ortiz, entire hives were subjected to saturation bombardment if even a single Vox blip suggested Tyrant's Legion activity. But it was on Glauer Prime that the true measure of Ortiz's vengeance would be felt. The orbital foundries above Glauer were ancient, forgotten relics of the Great Crusade, repurposed and cannibalized over millennia. Here, Huron's agents had established a clandestine forge ring, constructing replacement components for his ships and armoring the ever-growing ranks of the Tyrant's Legion. Data recovered later would show that over 15% of all weapons used by the Secessionist forces came from these platforms. Ortiz did not intend to capture them. He meant to annihilate them. Leading from the front, Ortiz deployed alongside the elite Vigilant Brethren, his personally selected Terminator retinue. They arrived in teleport flashes amidst the superstructure of the foundry, cutting through corridors thick with smoke and promethium steam. Resistance was fierce. Tyrant's Legion soldiers, clad in mismatched armor and chanting litanies to Huron, fought like cornered beasts. But they were not enough. Within hours, the command core of the station had been breached. Ortiz personally executed the Secessionist Forge Magos with a power maul that crackled with blue arcs of divine fury. The Red Scorpions then planted thermonuclear charges across the station's plasma grid. The explosion could be seen from orbit. Glor Prime bloomed like a flower of fire, its orbital ring breaking apart in slow, molten spirals. The debris would continue to fall into Viania's upper atmosphere for weeks, creating firestorms visible from the surface. It was not a surgical strike. It was an act of scorched earth vengeance, and it sent a message to the Maelstrom. Huron's empire would not just be dismantled, it would be erased. Yet not all victories come without cost. While Ortiz and his fleet drove the Secessionists from the Viania system, their flank was left exposed. Scattered elements of the Mantis warriors, operating under the radar with cloaked strike ships and pinpoint raiding tactics, struck at Imperial supply lines. One such raid saw the destruction of the Red Scorpion's rearmament freighter, Lex Imperialis, and the death of over 36 tech marines and apothecaries in a single boarding action. Another attack saw the Raptor's outpost on Fulgur's Bane gutted and its communications tower left burning in low gravity, a mocking glyph of the Mantis sigil etched into its blackened hull. Ortiz was furious. He ordered the immediate reprioritization of Loyalist efforts to hunt the Mantis warriors down and exterminate their warbands wherever they surfaced. It would mark the beginning of what would become known as the Silent War, a shadow conflict of assassination, espionage, and secretive strikes between the Mantis warriors and Raptors, stretching across shattered moons and warp-drenched void stations. But even as those shadows danced, the larger campaign had shifted. The capture of Viania cut Huron's supply lines in half. The loss of Glor Prime crippled his ability to reinforce or resupply. With the Carthan Confederacy destroyed, the Endymion cluster contested, and now Viania purged, Huron's territory was beginning to shrink. For the first time, he was losing ground. In his chamber aboard the Aegis Solari, Ortiz stood before a hololithic display, watching as red icons flickered and vanished across the star map. Each mark gone was another dagger pulled from the Imperium's throat, another step closer to vindication. And yet, beneath his strict, unmoving expression, there was caution. Huron had not yet committed his full strength. The Astral Claws had not mounted a counterattack, and the Lamenters, still silent, still lurking somewhere within the void, had yet to reveal their intentions. Ortiz turned away from the hololith. "This war," he said quietly, to no one, "is far from over." But for the first time since the fires of rebellion had been lit, it felt like the Imperium was no longer on the defensive. The Red Scorpions had struck, and the echoes of their vengeance would soon reach Badab itself. Even as the Tyrant's dominion fractured at its edges and the Imperium's noose tightened around Badab, a shadow was moving through the stars, a darkness not of chaos nor treachery, but of unyielding debt and ancient loyalty. It drifted beyond the fringe systems like a predator, silent and waiting. Few among the Loyalists had seen it, and fewer still understood its purpose. but those who had glimpsed the warship called it by one name, the Night Hag. It was the flagship of the Executioner's chapter, a somber relic of a bygone age. Its hull was forged before the end of the heresy, and its silhouette was unmistakable, a jagged, blade-shaped vessel adorned with iron-toothed ridges and skeletal iconography. It did not shine. It devoured the light around it. And now it was headed toward the heart of the conflict. The Executioners were not like other chapters. While the Red Scorpions polished their purity seals and recited passages of the Codex, the Executioners walked a path steeped in ritual and blood. Their entire culture revolved around the Oath of Service, an ancient edict as binding as any writ from the High Lords of Terra. And long ago, when their numbers had been brought low by a brutal xenos war, it was the Astral Claws who had sent ships and men to aid them. In return, the Executioners swore a debt to Huron's chapter. They had not forgotten it, and when the summons came, cloaked in coded binaric script, carrying the ancient crest of the Tiger Claws, the Executioners answered. They did not ask questions. They did not weigh loyalties. They only sharpened their axes and made ready for war. The first world to feel their wrath was Bellerophon's fall. The Marines errant had recently established a forward observation post there, hoping to secure a warp anchor for the next phase of the Loyalist advance. The world itself was barely more than a frozen tomb, ice-covered valleys and jagged mineral plateaus with Imperial prefabs and comms towers haphazardly deployed across the surface. The Marines errant, veterans of Void War, had grown complacent after weeks of silence. Their perimeter was loose. Their scanners were tuned to detect familiar enemies, traitor Astartes, Tyrant's Legion marauders, maybe even Mantis warrior ambushes. They were not prepared for what came. In the space of 10 minutes, all 5 of the outpost's primary Vox towers were annihilated by pinpoint orbital strikes. Fire lanced down from the void, shearing through ice and steel, vaporizing landing pads and igniting fuel reserves. Thunderhawks barely cleared the atmosphere before being cut from the sky. Then the Executioners descended. They didn't use stealth. They didn't come in waves. They fell like iron rain. Clad in dark ceramite marked with crimson axe sigils, the Executioners landed directly atop the primary command bunker, demolishing it with a mass teleport assault. Captain Fellhammer Vortigern, a towering warrior wielding a double-headed chain axe, led the charge. His war cry was not a shout, but a vow, spoken aloud to the Corpse Emperor, to his ancestors, and to the oath-bound duty he now fulfilled. The Marines errant fought valiantly, but valor was not enough. Their discipline shattered in the face of the Executioners' fury. Rooms turned to slaughterhouses. Corridors were piled with bodies. When the command company attempted a last stand near the firebase's generator core, Vortigern cleaved through their lines like a berserker of old. In less than 4 hours, the outpost was gone. Its remains were marked not by banners or glyphs, but by heads stacked in ritual pyramids, as was the Executioner's custom, a grim sign not of heresy but of homage. They did not kill in madness. They killed in duty. To the Executioners, it was a necessary rite. To the Imperium, it was an atrocity. Word reached the Loyalist High Command days later. At first, it was disbelief. The Executioners were a known but distant chapter, fiercely independent but not known for outright rebellion. The concept that they had turned their blades on their brothers struck many as madness. But then came the data streams, armor cam footage, burned Vox logs, sensor pings showing unmistakable Executioner vessel signatures fleeing into the Endymion Vale. The betrayal was undeniable. Commander Ortis, cold as ever, issued a proclamation. The Executioners were to be declared renegade. A warning was sent to all Imperial forces. Engage at will, no quarter. But there was a deeper concern. The Executioners had not declared secession. They had not broadcast allegiance to Huron. They had simply struck and vanished. What did that mean? Were they operating alone? Would more chapters answer the tyrant's call? The seeds of mistrust were sown, and they bloomed quickly. Meanwhile, in the dark, the Executioners planned their next blow. They had no interest in extended campaigns or territorial occupation. Their methods were surgical, almost ritualistic. They struck where the blow would be most felt. Not cities, not factories, hearts, symbols, names. Their next target, the Howling Griffins. A proud chapter with a storied history, the Howling Griffins had been mustering at Cairo's Vale, preparing to deploy alongside the Fire Angels in the northern Maelstrom corridor. They were fierce, methodical warriors, idealists who followed honor in every motion, and that made them the perfect target. The Executioners arrived under the veil of solar flare disruption. With the local star blinding most Auspex readings, they bypassed the Griffin's early warning systems entirely. Drop pods landed not in staggered waves, but in a single catastrophic volley. 2 full companies of Executioners slamming down in the middle of the Howling Griffin's base camp. Captain Vortigern led the assault again, joined now by Brother Marshal Arcturos, a warrior whose helm was carved in the shape of a snarling skull, and whose thunder hammer bore the names of every fallen executioner from the Hrud campaign. The battle was savage. The Howling Griffins did not fall easily. Sergeant after sergeant rallied squads into counterattacks, pushing back with the ferocity of cornered lions. But the Executioners were simply more brutal. They broke through barricades with their fists. They shattered dreadnought limbs with chain axes. They drove thunder hammers through Terminator plate like it was parchment. The turning point came when the Griffin's chapter banner was taken, wrenched from its pole as its bearer fell in a spray of gore. Arcturos lifted it high, looked to the sky, and then dropped it into the flames. It was not merely a military defeat. It was a humiliation. The Howling Griffins were broken that day. Their losses were grievous, and though they survived, they would never again operate as a full fighting force in the Badab campaign. Their vengeance would have to wait. The Executioners, as always, vanished. In the aftermath, debate raged across Loyalist command. Should the focus remain on Badab, or should hunting the Executioners now become priority? Some argued that every moment spent chasing the ghosts of an oath-bound chapter allowed Huron to entrench further. Others insisted that no war could be won while traitors stalked them in the dark. But Ortiz, ever the tactician, understood what had happened. This was not random. Huron had unleashed the Executioners at exactly the moment when Imperial unity was solidifying. He had used them like a scalpel, cutting into morale, cracking trust, weakening the bonds between chapters. And worse, he had done it without ever revealing his hand. The Executioners continued to claim they served only an old oath, not a rebellion. They still spoke the Emperor's name. They still recited the litanies. But their loyalty belonged to a promise, not to terror. And in that gray twilight, Huron's war evolved again. No longer was it a battle between secession and obedience. It was now a war of faith versus structure, of ancient loyalties versus modern authority. The Executioners had made their stand, and now the Imperium would bleed from wounds it could not see. Long before the cataclysm at Cairo's Vale, and the screams of burning banners echoed through the ranks of the Howling Griffins, there had been another plan moving in silence, deeper than orbital strikes and more devastating than the assault of drop pods. This plan was meant to break the spine of the Tyrant's rebellion, not through blood, but through denial. The war for Badab was no longer a war of territory. That illusion had shattered beneath the burning hives of Sagan III, the orbital wreckage of Vianaya, and the shattered alliances spilled across the Endymion stars. Now it had become a war of momentum. The tyrant had begun to slow, but he had not stopped. Every day his war machines still churned, his ships still fueled, his armor still repaired, his munitions still flowing. To truly end the rebellion, the Imperium would have to strike at the heart of Huron's lifeblood, the forges of Angstrom. Angstrom had long been overlooked by the Administratum. Tucked into a hollow region of space known as the Halo Veil, the world had once been a minor Mechanicus bastion, an enclave that produced standardized STC components for basic servitor systems and void ship scaffolding. Its ancient manufactorums were massive, echoing tombs of steel and sacred circuitry, forgotten by most of the galaxy, but not by Lake Huron. The tyrant had, in secret, forged a covenant with the Forge Masters of Angstrom long before open war began. When the Adeptus Mechanicus proved too slow, too hesitant to offer supplies at the speed he demanded, Huron took what he needed and ensured that the Forge World's tech priests, already disillusioned with Terra's hierarchy, were convinced to turn a blind eye. In exchange for freedom from the Martian Conclave's tithe restrictions, Angstrom was given patronage. Transport ships filled with raw ore and slaves from conquered systems arrived in regular convoys. In return, Angstrom's ancient manufactories began producing weapons, power armor components, munitions, and even warp drives, all rerouted through the Tyrant's Legion. It was through Angstrom that the war continued, and the Imperium finally saw it. It began with whispers. Encrypted messages, partially corrupted astropathic fragments, spoke of convoys disappearing. Surveillance-picked feeds from recon craft caught battle cruisers marked with Astral Claw insignia docking at Angstrom's orbital harbors, despite the planet's registered neutrality. A rogue Skitarii Alpha was captured by Fire Angels during an ambush raid in the Carthel spheres. Upon interrogation, he revealed, under duress, that Angstrom was no longer neutral. It was supplying the Secessionists at full capacity. Virant Ortiz ordered an emergency summit aboard the Red Scorpion's flagship, Tertius Victor. The decision was unanimous. Angstrom had to burn. But unlike Sagan or Vianaya, this assault could not be loud. A full-scale siege would risk drawing in the greater Mechanicus, already watching the Badab conflict with uneasy interest. A direct attack could fracture relations across the segmentum, and worse, bring more Forge worlds into the war under the banner of Mars. So, Ortiz chose a different path. A strike force, surgical, devastating, untraceable. The kill team was drawn from a mixture of elite elements, Red Scorpion's veterans, Sons of Medusa tech marines, Fire Angels flamers, and the ever-evasive Raptors, who had recently earned a claim for rooting out Mantis warrior cells in the asteroid belts of Pale Reach. At their head was Captain Sedalian, a grim figure in pitch-black Terminator plate, decorated not with scrolls or symbols, but engraved kill tallies running down his vambraces. Sedalian was a specialist in void operations, known for his brutal doctrine: eliminate the forge, the fire dies. Eliminate the fire, the weapon cannot be lifted. They called him the Emberless One. The strike began on the far side of Angstrom's planetary orbit, masked by the gravitational shadow of a nearby ice moon. Using a captured Mantis warrior stealth vessel, Sedalian's team descended undetected through Angstrom's outer atmosphere, avoiding radar and auspex fields by deploying during a planetary tech quake, a natural electrical phenomenon that periodically shorted out wide-range detection systems. They touched down in a maintenance trench near the Magna Core core, one of Angstrom's deepest and most vital power reactors. The approach was silent. The only sound, boots on ferrocrete and the soft whine of servo arms locking into kill position. Inside the core, they discovered what no scribe on Terra had recorded: Angstrom had become a dark forge. The Manufactoria no longer echoed with the sacred rites of the Omnissiah. Instead, the cogitators were infused with rogue code, demon-infested subroutines buzzing just beneath sanctioned binaric prayers. Gene-coded servitors labored endlessly, their faces sheared to bone. Bolters stamped with the claw icon of Huron's legion rolling off the assembly lines by the thousands. Sedalion gave the order. The team moved. First, they disabled the outer coolant regulation spires, planting melta charges inside the control nodes. Then came the data crypt, penetrated by a Sons of Medusa tech marine, who, in his zeal, sacrificed his own implants to corrupt the STC archive. As his brain overloaded with feedback, he used his final breath to ignite a logic bomb in the core's sub-mind. Data screams echoed for miles. Finally, Sedalion himself led the charge into the heat core chamber. Here, amidst rivers of molten metal, they planted the Vulcanus bomb, a modified plasma warhead designed to destabilize geothermal power networks. But before they could withdraw, the enemy arrived. Huron's personal elite, the Branded, a cadre of Astral Claws Terminators, rumored to have survived the fall of Galen, teleported in with roaring gravitic thunder. Each bore scorched heraldry and bore arms twice reforged. The tunnels became a slaughterhouse. Flamer blasts and chain fist clashes turned the core's lowest levels into a metal-blistered charnel pit. Sedalion fought through 3 of the Branded himself, his power maul cracking skulls like fruit. When the final warrior lunged at him with a serrated chain blade, Sedalion grabbed the enemy's arm, locked eyes, and said only, "For every weapon you built, here is silence." Then he triggered the warhead. The explosion did not bloom. It collapsed, imploding the core inwards before releasing a rising firestorm that raced through the forge's arterial tunnels. Machinery crumpled like wet parchment, armories shattered in thermal backdrafts. The Magna core died screaming. Angstrom went dark. The aftermath was chaos. Across the Maelstrom, shipments ceased. Huron's ships, returning to orbit from deep patrols, found nothing but debris fields and blackened wreckage. The once proud orbital yards were now charred skeletons, their internal atmosphere vents venting toxic gas into the void. And worse still, no one could prove the Imperium had done it. There were no broadcasts, no banners, no evidence, only silence. The Mechanicus, forced to reckon with the truth, claimed Angstrom had suffered a catastrophic containment failure. No further investigation was allowed, but Huron knew. He knew exactly who had struck him, and he did not forget. In the war rooms aboard the Tertius Victor, Sedalion's empty sarcophagus was sealed in reverent silence. He had not survived the blast, but his mission had, and his legacy would burn brighter than the fires he unleashed. With Angstrom dead, Huron's ability to rearm had been mortally wounded. The war was turning, and somewhere in the void, the tyrant clenched his fists and cursed the Emperor's name, not out of hatred, but because, for the first time, he felt the jaws of defeat close in. The shadow of Angstrom had passed, and only ruin remained. While Angstrom burned in secret and the executioners painted the void with blood, a quieter agony brewed beneath the surface of the war. It had not come with declarations, nor proud banners, nor the fiery dogma of the Codex Astartes. It came with silence, with sorrow, with the soft, mournful toll of failure ringing across 1,000 vox channels like the sigh of a dying world. The Lamenters had joined Huron's rebellion, not for power, nor vengeance, nor heresy, but for the faint hope of survival. And now that hope was slipping through their gauntleted fingers like blood through fractured ceramite. They had always been cursed, not by the warp nor the Emperor's wrath, but by fate itself. A chapter born of noble gene stock, descendants of Sanguinius, blessed with grace and speed, twisted by ill fortune into a legacy of endless suffering. Wherever the Lamenters fought, misfortune followed. Allies turned cold, victories came at unthinkable cost. Peace was always just beyond reach. Their fall into Huron's cause had been a desperate gamble. After centuries of penance, after being all but ignored by the High Lords, the Lamenters had hoped that siding with the Maelstrom Warders might offer them a new path, a way to prove themselves not as outcasts, but as protectors. They had not counted on war. Not like this. And now they were about to pay the price. The Lamenters had been operating in the outer edges of the Maelstrom since the war began, rarely deploying in full strength. They were not suited for total warfare. Their numbers were limited, their gene seed reserves already strained. Instead, they specialized in precision raids, crippling supply routes, sabotaging fleet deployments, extracting critical personnel from collapsing fronts. But by late 908 M41, the tide of war demanded sacrifice. Huron ordered the Lamenters to assist in a crucial operation, recovering their chapter bark, the Mater Lacrimarum, a great vessel of ancient origin that had gone missing in the wake of a warp storm during an early engagement near the Veiled Passage. Intelligence reports suggested that the ship had emerged from the storm, badly damaged and adrift, near the orbital debris field surrounding Zarathustra's fall, an abandoned forge world lost to internal civil strife 2 centuries prior. It was a desperate mission, but for the Lamenters, recovering the Mater Lacrimarum was more than salvage. It was survival. The bark contained precious relics, gene seed reserves, and centuries of their chapter's written history, stored in memory crystals sealed in stasis vaults. It was their legacy, their soul. So they went. 3 companies, led by Captain Malachim Foros himself, deployed with speed and silence. Their Thunderhawks skirted the fringes of Mechanicus sensor webs. Their escort ships traveled under stealth screens, slipping through asteroid fields and ion clouds. They reached the dead world's orbit unchallenged. But someone was already waiting. The Minotaurs had arrived days earlier. A loyalist chapter with a reputation for brutality and ironclad obedience to the High Lords, the Minotaurs were unlike most of their brethren. They claimed no homeworld. Their origins were shrouded in secrecy. And when they were deployed, they arrived not as knights or champions, but as executioners. They had been tasked with one objective: cripple the Secessionist fleet and annihilate the Lamenters. There would be no warning. As the Mater Lacrimarum came into view, its hull broken, trailing ionized vapor like the breath of a wounded leviathan, the Lamenters moved to secure docking locks and initiate recovery operations. It was then that the Minotaurs struck. Their fleet emerged from behind the orbital horizon of Zarathustra's second moon, burn engines cold until the last second. Aboard the battle barge Daedalus Krata, Chapter Master Asterion Moloch stood at the prow of his command deck, clad in ornate Terminator armor etched with bronze Minotaur heads. His voice when he gave the order to fire was calm, flat, unemotional. Begin culling. The opening salvo shattered the Lamenter's rearguard. 3 escort frigates were torn in half by macro cannon fire before they could raise shields. A squadron of Thunderhawks exploded in low orbit, scattering burning debris across the Mater Lacrimarum's dorsal plating. Foros immediately called for retreat, but the trap had closed. The Minotaurs deployed boarding torpedoes by the dozens, each one slamming into the drifting bark with thunderous impact. Lamenters fought to hold the corridors, but the enemy was overwhelming. The Minotaurs were not just numerous, they were relentless. They moved like a machine, advancing with coordinated discipline and brutal efficiency. The halls of the Mater Lacrimarum, once filled with whispered prayers and stasis chambers of legacy, became corridors of butchery. One by one, the relic vaults fell. The Minotaurs did not stop to catalog. They destroyed. Plasma charges detonated along the archive decks. Gene seed storage bays were breached and burned. Stasis fields collapsed. The memory of centuries wiped out in minutes. Foros fought like a fury incarnate. His glaive crackled with energy as he cleaved through Minotaur boarding teams, holding the central bridge against impossible odds. But even his valor could not halt the tide. As casualties mounted, as the ship groaned under repeated impact strikes, he gave the only order he could. All survivors, abandon ship. A small detachment, barely 60 battle brothers, managed to reach escape pods and blast out into the void. Many were destroyed before even clearing the wreck. A few reached the edge of the battle, but only one pod made it to Loyalist hands, intercepted days later by a patrol of the Red Scorpions. Inside, 5 Lamenters remained, half-conscious, bleeding, but alive, and with them came the truth. The Mater Lacrimarum was lost, but the damage went deeper than wreckage. The Lamenters had been shattered. Their chapter strength, already low, had been gutted. The survivors were scattered across the Maelstrom, isolated and leaderless. Foros himself was listed as missing in action, presumed dead. Word of the slaughter spread like wildfire. The Minotaurs released no statement, offered no justification. To them, it was a sanctioned operation executed with precision, but to others, it was murder. Within the Loyalist ranks, voices of dissent grew louder. The Salamanders condemned the action as excessive. The Raptors questioned the ethics of deploying the Minotaurs at all. Even among the Red Scorpions, whose loyalty to Terra was absolute, there was unease. If the Lamenters, a loyalist lineage, even if misguided, could be slaughtered without trial, who was next? The war's moral center began to tremble, and far away on Badab Primaris, Lufgt Huron stood before a great mural carved into the obsidian wall of his throne room, a depiction of a bleeding angel, wings broken, reaching toward the stars, a symbol of the Lamenter's fall. He looked upon it for a long time, then turned away and whispered, "They'll see now what loyalty buys them." In silence and fire, the Lamenters had been broken, not by the enemies they defied, but by the Imperium they still loved. By 909 M41, the Badab War had become something grotesque. The initial ideals of independence, of sovereignty, of righteous secession, these had long since been smothered under ash and blood. What remained was brutality, desperation, betrayal. The Secessionist alliance had begun to splinter. The Lamenters were shattered. The Mantis warriors were ghosts among the stars. The executioners stalked the void, but even they had grown wary of the web they'd walked into. And through it all, one chapter rose like a silent tide, uninvited, unrelenting, and unmerciful. The Carcharodons had arrived. No warning, no announcement, only a signal, transmitted in binaric code to the Red Scorpions and Inquisition, stating that Carcharodon Astra, Strike Force Uthika, has entered the Maelstrom Theater under directive silence. To most chapters, the arrival of reinforcements would have sparked coordination, planning, an exchange of strategic intelligence. But the Carcharodons did not seek counsels. They did not answer hails. They did not wait. They hunted. The world of tranquility had once been a bastion of culture and thought. Ancient libraries carved into its stone cliffs, observatories that gazed beyond the Maelstrom, and sprawling hives built to mimic old Earth's long-lost architectural beauty. It had also been the spiritual home of the Mantis warriors, a jewel nestled deep in their territories, sacred not because of its wealth, but because it was theirs. But tranquility had been marked. The Carcharodons made planetfall in the wake of a solar flare, their dropships emerging from the storm-choked void like shadows torn from the Emperor's nightmares. No orbital warning was given, no attempt at diplomacy. The hives awoke to alarms, then to screaming, then to silence. Witnesses, what few survived, spoke of black-armored giants moving through the cities without hesitation. Their armor bore no heraldry beyond the pallid shark teeth patterns across their pauldrons, and their helmets were featureless, their eyes burning dimly behind red glowing visors. They did not issue challenges. They did not make speeches. They simply killed. The Mantis warriors garrisoned on Tranquility had prepared for a siege. They had hardened the hives, laid traps, reinforced their choke points, but nothing they had expected matched what came. The Carcharodons did not fight like Astartes. They fought like predators. Small kill teams flowed through sewer tunnels, ventilation shafts, service elevators, places no one expected power-armored warriors to enter. They didn't attack from the front. They disassembled the defense from within. A quarter of the Mantis warriors' garrison was dead before the main barracks ever activated. When the full assault began, it came from all angles. The sky above the high spires filled with streaks of ceramite drop pods. Assault squads dropped through stained glass windows like birds of prey, chain swords snarling. In Hive 4I, the Mantis chapter, Master Sartak stood his ground with a company of his best. They fought like demons, their green armor stained black with ash and blood, their blades flashing through the haze of bolter smoke. But the Carcharodons were not there for conquest. They were there for punishment. The Red Scorpions arrived too late. When their fleet reached orbit to lend aid, they were met by silence. Tranquility's orbital defenses had been torn down. Its primary Vox spires had been destroyed. Fires still burned across the upper hive layers, choking the atmosphere with acrid smoke. The Carcharodons were already leaving, their warships vanishing into the warp without reply. No message, no victory declaration. The surface was a grave. Over a third of the Mantis warriors stationed on Tranquility had been killed. The rest were either captured or exiled. The great halls of their libraries were defiled, ancient relics reduced to rubble, and the planet itself was declared contaminated, its value to the Imperium deemed erased by the trauma it had endured. The Loyalists called it a cleansing. The Mantis warriors would never forgive it. Inquisitor Jarndyce Frayne, the chief arbiter assigned to oversee Loyalist compliance and monitor chapter behavior throughout the campaign, filed a sealed report regarding the Carcharodons' actions. The report listed multiple violations of Adeptus Astartes' warfare protocol, including unprovoked attack without formal declaration, destruction of civilian infrastructure, termination of wounded Astartes in medical bays, use of experimental nerve agents in sublevels of Hive 4I. The report ended with a single line, redacted in later versions. And yet, no war in the Emperor's name is clean. For the Imperium, the assault on Tranquility signaled a shift. It was no longer enough to win. It was no longer enough to force surrender or secure key systems. The Secessionists had to be broken, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. The Carcharodons were not deployed for strategy, they were deployed for effect, and they succeeded. Across the Maelstrom, word of Tranquility's fall spread like a contagion. The Mantis warriors retreated into the black, refusing direct orders, avoiding all Loyalist contact. Once honored sons of the Emperor, they now operated like rogue elements, striking at supply lines, sabotaging outposts, acting not with strategy but with vengeance. They did not renounce the Imperium, but they no longer trusted it. Some say that Sartak, wounded and disillusioned, vanished into the halo stars with a handful of his warriors. Others whisper that the remnants of the Mantis chapter swore vengeance. not against the traitors, but against those who claimed to be loyal, yet bled their brothers without mercy. The Carcharodons, meanwhile, vanished into the warp. No record exists of where they went. No communication was made. The only trace left behind was in the minds of those who survived their fury, and the hollow cities left in their wake. In the campaign logs of the Red Scorpions, the assault on Tranquility was marked as Operation Pale Harvest. In the legends of the surviving Mantis warriors, it would be known as the Butcher's Wake. And on Badab Primaris, in the shadow of the Palace of Thorns, Huron heard the reports with a mix of satisfaction and fury. The Carcharodons had done what he could not. They had turned brother against brother so thoroughly, so completely, that trust itself was dismembered. He had asked for a war of sovereignty. They had answered with a war of annihilation. And though the net around him was tightening, though his world was surrounded by fleets, he knew one thing remained true. The Imperium was bleeding from the inside now, and that was a wound no bolter could mend. As the void tightened around Badab Primaris, the tyrant's eyes turned inward. He no longer trusted his own stars. The secessionist cause was buckling under its own weight. The Lamenters were broken, their iconography fading into memory. The Mantis warriors had become feral in their vengeance, while the executioners vanished into the galactic fringes, having paid their debt in blood and honor. Even the Tyrant's Legion, once a proud creation of discipline and order, had started to unravel into squabbling regiments and unstable cults of personality. But Huron Blackheart, no longer the noble chapter master Lufgt Huron, did not flinch. He adapted. If the outer worlds could no longer hold, he would make his fortress impenetrable. Not with walls, but with fear. Beneath the surface of Badab Primaris, unseen by the Imperium's eyes, was the Iron Labyrinth. The surface of the planet had been mapped by Administratum scribes long ago. Fortress mountains, weather towers, spire citadels topped with gun batteries and shield domes. But those maps were incomplete. What no outsider knew, what even the most loyal of the Astral Claws were seldom permitted to speak of, was that Badab had been hollowed out over centuries. Through his secret pacts with the Mechanicus enclaves of Angstrom and rogue builders from the Pale Heliopolis, Huron had turned his homeworld into a subterranean megastructure of winding corridors, automated forges, shifting kill boxes, and decoy control centers. No single schematic existed, sections reconfigured weekly. Turrets were programmed to recognize only the latest IFF codes. Any misstep, any hesitation, and even a veteran Astral Claw could find themselves atomized by their own defense systems. This was no bunker. It was a war engine buried in rock and fire, and now it would become his last sanctuary. While loyalist forces continued to purge the outer systems, Huron began the final phase of his plan. Every remaining resource was drawn inward. Forge cities were dismantled. The moons of Badab were stripped of personnel. Ships were scuttled if they could not make the final approach. Their parts were fused into armor plating and bulkhead reinforcements. Mortals from the Tyrant's Legion were herded into the labyrinth and given a single command: fight until your last breath. Huron knew the Loyalists were coming, and he would not meet them in orbit. He would bury them in the dark. The Loyalists prepared. In the aftermath of Tranquility and the spiraling chaos left behind by the Carcharodons, the High Command realized the endgame was upon them. Ortis was dead, slain during the betrayal at Grief, and command had passed to Karab Kuln, now Lord High Commander of the Badab Reclamation. Kuln was no ideologue. He had witnessed too much carnage to hold illusions about glory, but he understood war. He had studied siege doctrine for decades, and he knew Badab Primaris would not fall to bombardment alone. "There is no fortress," he famously said, "that cannot be broken from within." So he gathered his hammers. The final assault force was a mosaic of bitter survivors, each carrying grudges deeper than their gene seed. The Red Scorpions, still resolute, would lead the core push into the labyrinth. The Sons of Medusa, cold and calculating, were assigned to void the forge routes and cripple the plasma core spines. The Fire Angels, burning with silent rage after years of attritional war, demanded the vanguard position in honor of their fallen brothers at Cairo's Veil. The Exorcists, ever the watchers of the warp, had quietly detected strange power signatures in the deepest levels of the labyrinth, and they came with null arrays and whispered litanies. Each chapter was given a target. Each was told to expect the worst. None of them were truly prepared. They made landfall in waves. Drop pods screamed through the atmosphere, punching through orbital defenses that had already been softened by the Star Phantom's fleet. Thunderhawks descended like birds of prey, trailing burning contrails across the sky. Entire companies of Astartes marched across the blackened surface, their boots grinding into the bones of Badab's last defenders. But it was once they reached the labyrinth's mouth, the Gates of Thorns, that the war changed. Because from that point forward, nothing made sense. The labyrinth was alive. Coded servitor machines walked the halls, tearing apart walls and rebuilding them behind the advancing Marines. Vox signals were swallowed by static or looped back as mocking echoes. Gravity wells shifted. Floor plates rotated. Trapdoors dropped entire squads into ambush nests, where turret fire and flamers turned them to ash. The Exorcists were the first to realize something darker had taken root. In the lower tunnels, they discovered shrines, not to Chaos, but to Huron himself. Carvings, iconography, painted depictions of the tyrant as a god-king, wreathed in lightning and crowned in flame. These weren't standard propaganda. They were religious, fanatical. The truth was sickening. The Tyrant's Legion had become more than a force. It had become a cult. Worse still, many of the mortals they fought were no longer entirely human. Reports confirmed gene splicing, crude muscle grafts, chemical induction rituals. Some enemies displayed Astartes-like resilience without the proper organ profile, horrors stitched together in dark laboratories, weapons of desperation created as the end approached. Kulin's order was simple: purge without mercy. The Red Scorpions, in particular, took this to heart. They fought like executioners, clearing chamber after chamber with cold precision. They mapped each kill zone as they advanced, seeding the labyrinth with their own relays, forcing stability onto madness through relentless discipline. But the deeper they pushed, the worse it became. In the narthex spine, the Fire Angels lost nearly a full company when a false floor collapsed into a magma shaft. In the vaults of breath, Sons of Medusa tech marines were ambushed by Tyrant's legionnaires in armored exosuits using stolen Mechanicus relics. In the Echo Sanctum, Exorcist librarians reported psychic interference from a figure deep within the walls, a presence that spoke in Huron's voice, yet was everywhere and nowhere. The labyrinth had become a tomb, and it meant to take its invaders with it. Then came the turning point. Kuln himself led a strike force toward the central core, where it was believed Huron had made his final stand. The path there was flooded with radiation, its doors sealed with triply encrypted blast wards. Only by sacrificing his own dreadnought escort did Kuln breach the inner sanctum. Inside he found not a throne room, but a surgery. Stasis tanks lined the walls. Most were broken. Inside, mutated corpses floated in chemical slurry, early experiments in gene harvesting, likely taken from fallen Marines. At the center of the chamber, a massive Medicae throne glowed with flickering life, and upon it sat Huron, or what remained of him. The Tyrant of Badab was more machine than man. Half his body was fused with crude augmetics. One arm ended in a clawed weapon sleeve. Tubes fed directly into his lungs. His face, though burned and broken, still bore the sneer of command. And when he opened his eyes, Karab Kulin felt the presence of a man who had lost everything, yet still clung to the illusion of control. "So this is it," Huron rasped. "The great wolf comes to gnaw at the tyrant's bones." Kulin didn't answer. He simply raised his bolter. But Huron wasn't finished. "I bled for this Imperium, bled for the stars, and when we needed help, you let us rot." There was no remorse, no plea, only bitter pride. And then the lights flared and the floor erupted. It was a trap. Huron had never intended to win. He had simply meant to lure the Imperium's finest into the heart of the storm. The labyrinth began to collapse. Cullen escaped. Barely. The rest of the Red Scorpions did not. As the surface of Badab split open, great geysers of flame rose into the sky. The iron labyrinth, unable to sustain its own treachery, tore itself apart. One last act of defiance from a world that had given everything for a dying ideal. And in that fire, the war began to end. Not with cheers, not with banners, but with silence. Because even in defeat, Huron had made them bleed, and the galaxy would never forget the price paid in the depths of the Iron Labyrinth. From orbit, Badab Primaris no longer resembled a planet. It was a funeral pyre. The fires that erupted from the Iron Labyrinth had not receded. They raged unchecked across the crust, venting superheated vapor into the atmosphere and choking the daylight under black clouds. Continents cracked, oceans boiled, cities, those few that still stood, bled streams of ash from shattered arcologies and toppled hab blocks. But amid this ruin, one structure stood untouched, its silhouette stark against the swirling clouds. The Palace of Thorns. Not merely a fortress, not just a command center. It was the seat of Lufgt Huron's defiance. Built into the tallest basalt mountains on Badab, its obsidian spires pierced the sky like the ribs of some buried colossus. Its walls were reinforced with plasteel fused with the bones of titanic creatures from the Maelstrom's fringe. Every window was a gun port, every corridor a redoubt. And at its heart, somewhere behind dozens of layers of auto turrets, energy shields, and vault doors, the tyrant still breathed. The Imperium had clawed its way here, through stars and blood and flame. Now it would claim its prize. But the palace would not fall like the labyrinth. This would be war in its purest form. Karab Kulin did not hesitate. With the Iron Labyrinth's collapse, the final veil had been lifted. There were no more fronts to draw, no more diplomatic threads to tug. Every force that had fought, bled, or wept for the Badab War knew what must come next. A strike that would shatter not just Huron, but the very memory of his defiance. Kulin summoned his blade, the fury of Eax, and ordered a planetary landing en masse. The hammer was coming down. The assault began at dawn, if dawn could be called such on a world choking in soot and black flame. Red Scorpion's drop pods fell first, slamming into the outer curtain wall and disgorging veterans in phalanx formation. Behind them came the sons of Medusa, their green armor wreathed in arcs of lightning, disrupting shield harmonics with pulse surge axes and haywire blasters. Then came the Star Phantoms. Chosen for their siegecraft, the Star Phantoms advanced with methodical, mechanical precision, their Devastator squads supported by mobile emplacements and walking dreadnoughts. They knew this battle would not be quick. They had trained for this moment for decades. Every inch of ground was contested. Mortar shells screamed down from the palace's upper tiers, detonating among landing zones before troops could deploy. Gun towers raked the battlefield with torrents of Lascanan fire, cutting grav vehicles in half and melting ceramite armor into slag. Minefields lit up in orange arcs as Thunderhawks tried to clear narrow ravines for extraction points, and through it all, the defenders stood firm. The last Astral Claws, less than a company's worth, held the gates. They were no longer the shining warriors of the early Secession. Their armor was blackened, scorched, patched with makeshift repairs, but their hearts had hardened to steel. They fought with the fury of those with nothing left to lose. In the grand antechambers they had once paraded through in victory, they now made their stand. Bolter fire echoed down sacred halls. Bayonet charges spilled into throne rooms. A Red Scorpion squad was vaporized entirely by a plasma conduit that had been rerouted into the main stairwell. Even in ruin, the palace was killing them. Kulin led from the front. Clad in ornate war plate engraved with the names of every world liberated during the campaign, he charged the main gates alongside a breaching unit of Stern Guard veterans. With power mauls and melta charges, they cleared the entrance, crushing through barricades and tearing into the front courtyard like a tidal wave of retribution. The Sons of Medusa followed close behind, bypassing traps and security locks through techno-exorcism rites known only to their forge kin. They moved through maintenance corridors, vents, and warp-shielded transit tubes, slowly unraveling the palace's power grid node by node. With each fallen shield, a new level became exposed, and still, Huron did not appear. Deep within the palace, the tyrant waited. Not in a throne room, not among banners and command thrones, but in the nerve spire, a vertical control tower buried beneath the palace's spinal architecture. It was a command node linked directly to all remaining defense systems, atmosphere regulators, and orbital weapons arrays. Here, seated in a throne of adamant and pain suppressors, Lufgt Huron made his final preparations. He could no longer walk unaided. The damage done during the siege of the labyrinth had worsened. His left arm was missing from the elbow. His lungs were filled with metal. A bionic spine fed into his brainstem, regulating the nerves that screamed in agony with every breath. But his eyes burned, and around him, dozens of mortals and servitor thralls worked in silence, rerouting power, preparing charges, and finalizing escape vectors. A last play, a dying gambit, because Huron, above all else, would not be captured. The inner sanctum breach began 3 hours into the assault. Having cleared the perimeter and dropped the last of the palace's curtain walls, the Star Phantoms detonated the southern tower from below, using an underground reactor line. The explosion triggered a cascade of structural collapses, enough to bring down a portion of the outer citadel and expose the entrance to the nerve spire itself. Kulin took the breach personally. He led 10 veterans into the opening, carving his way down narrow corridors and blood-slick steps, bolter fire and grav blasts shaking the walls with every advance. They moved fast, knowing that time was no longer their ally. The palace's rumbling had grown louder. Entire sections were folding in on themselves. Something was wrong. At the foot of the spire, they found the throne, and it was empty. Only a bloodied trail of servitor oil and torn cloth led away into the escape shaft. Above them, the palace began to howl, every warning klaxon triggered at once. Vox channels screamed with garbled machine cant, and high above the structure, the spire's core reactor flared to life. Huron had done the unthinkable. He was going to bring it all down. Kulin issued the evacuation order. Astartes units fell back as quickly as war allowed. Orbital shuttles re-engaged. Medicaid dreadnoughts carried wounded by the dozens. Fire angels detonated the eastern walls to clear paths through rubble-choked causeways. The entire planet shook as the reactor reached critical mass. But at the center of it all, amid falling stone and collapsing towers, Karab Kulin stood alone in the spire, staring at the abandoned throne, listening to the rising whine of the palace's death scream. He spoke no words. only lowered his head and made the sign of the Aquila, then turned and walked into the smoke. The Palace of Thorns died screaming. Its towers snapped and fell like broken fingers, its spires shattered in plumes of glass and flame. Vaults that had not seen light in 5,000 years were consumed in molten fury. The crater it left would remain a scar on Badab for millennia. And in the aftermath there was no body, no trace of Lufgt Huron, only ruin. The tyrant was gone, but the echoes of his palace would linger. In every burned sigil, in every brother lost, in every whisper for centuries to come that dared to ask, what if he was right? And what would you become if no one answered when you called? The fires of Badab Primaris had finally been smothered, if not by water, then by ruin. Where once its obsidian towers carved holes in the sky, now only jagged monoliths remained, ash-draped skeletons of defiance scattered across the continent-wide crater where the Palace of Thorns had stood. The sky was a tapestry of gray, not storm nor smoke, but the quiet veil that followed devastation too total to name. The winds carried no birds, no breath, only the faint whistle of soot sliding down steel wreckage. The war was over, and yet no one cheered. There were no victory sermons, no banners raised in triumph. The Astartes did not stand in parade. The citizens of the Imperium did not chant or kneel, because what remained was not the echo of a glorious crusade. It was the silence after fire. Carab Cullen stood at the edge of the blast crater, his armor scorched, his blade dulled and cracked down the middle. The fury of Ajax had split in the final breach, its machine spirit overwhelmed by the energies of the collapsing reactor beneath the nerve spire. He carried the broken halves now, not as weapons but as relics. He did not speak. There were no words left. The Red Scorpions stood behind him in silence, their armor darkened not with paint or heraldry, but with soot, dried blood, and the weight of all they had endured. Of the 4 companies that had landed on Badab, only one remained operational. The others were gone, swallowed in the labyrinth, lost in the choke points of the lower halls, entombed in the molten catacombs that had collapsed when the palace died. Cullen breathed in the ash and closed his eyes. The tyrant was gone, but so was half the war's soul. The official record would be compiled months later by the scribes of the Ordo Hereticus, sealed under 12 layers of encryption, stamped with the sigils of no fewer than 6 High Lords. The final decree was brief, clinical, efficient. Let it be known that Lufgt Huron, former chapter master of the Astral Claws, is presumed dead. His chapter is disbanded, their lineage erased. The Maelstrom Rebellion has been put down in full accordance with the Lex Imperialis. The following forces are to undergo cleansing, reparations, and where applicable, censure. The next pages named them the Executioners, exiled to a penitent crusade without end. The Mantis Warriors, stripped of their homeworld and forced into a century of contrition. The Lamenters, declared borderline extinct and sent far beyond segmentum boundaries, their numbers too small to remain in Imperial sight. The Marines Errant, shamed and withdrawn. The Fire Angels, fractured by flame and fury. Even the Red Scorpions, paragons of loyalty, were quietly told to stand down and allow the Ordo to retake oversight. The Imperium had won, and like all its victories, it came at the cost of everything. The Badlands of Badab Primaris became the funeral grounds for unburied dead. No tech priest dared send retrieval teams into the wreckage of the Iron Labyrinth. The reactor zones remained hot with residual warp energies. Entire districts hummed with strange electromagnetic pulses, leftovers, perhaps, from some final gift the tyrant had laced into his machines. Whole vox echoes of screams were still heard days after the last fighting ceased, trapped perhaps in data loops or memory circuits buried beneath the rubble. No monuments were raised, no statues erected. Only a single slab of black marble was installed near the landing site, used by the Star Phantoms, engraved with a single phrase in High Gothic. In this place, loyalty turned to ash. Elsewhere, the political fallout began. Carthan's collapse opened new trade lanes, quickly filled by imperial noble houses eager to claim salvage rights. The Mechanicus dispatched fleets to reclaim the fractured data cores of Angstrom, swearing on a dozen cog seals that they had nothing to do with the Forge World's dark complicity. The High Lords were content to let the record stand. Huron had rebelled. The Imperium had responded. The threat was eliminated. No need to examine why it had happened. No need to ask what made a hero into a traitor. The Inquisition saw it differently. Inquisitor Jarndyce Frayne compiled over 800 sealed pages of testimony, battlefield logs, and philosophical commentary detailing the moral erosion that had turned noble warriors into apostates. He called it the Tyrant's Seed, and the thesis was damning. Lufgt Huron was not a heretic. He was a loyal son, crushed between neglect and necessity. He rebelled not against the Emperor, but against the void left in the Emperor's absence. This war was not born of chaos. It was born of silence, of orders unanswered, of sacrifice unrewarded. The Badab War was not an aberration. It was a warning. The tome was never published. Its author vanished shortly after filing his final amendment. And far away in the Maelstrom, the silence began to fracture. Rogue traders whispered of a black ship prowling the edge of the warp. A warship, ancient, scarred, adorned with a red star and flayed chapter sigils. It moved through pirate-infested regions with impunity. Astropathic stations went dark. Vox beacons were hijacked by gravel-voiced messages demanding surrender. Then the same voice, rasped, mechanical, spoke one sentence before every channel cut. The tyrant lives. The Red Corsairs were born, and Huron Blackheart, missing but not dead, had become something worse than a traitor. He had become a legend. Back on Terra, in the sealed halls of the Librarius Strategos, archivists debated what to do with the records of the Badab War. Some argued for deletion. Anomalies must not be remembered. Others for elevation, let it serve as a moral fable. In the end, it was buried. Not forgotten, but hidden. Only the Death Watch and the Inquisition were given full access. Only they would know how close the Imperium had come to losing itself. Not to xenos, not to chaos, but to its own reflection. And so the stars turned. The Maelstrom still howled. The warp storm still flickered like veins of fire across the galactic map. And somewhere out there in the blackness, a red-eyed figure watched. Still wounded, still burning, still waiting. The Tyrant of Badab was gone. But the silence after fire, it had only just begun. The war had ended, but the reckoning had only just begun. The flames that once engulfed the Maelstrom had given way to bureaucratic silence, a different kind of fire, colder, more suffocating. For the Imperium, the Badab War was a gaping wound it could not allow to fester, not because of the blood spilled, but because of what it said aloud, even if no one dared to listen. That loyalty, when stretched far enough, could snap. And now the Imperium had to decide what to do with the remnants. The chapters who had not fallen fully into rebellion, but had stood beside the tyrant long enough to become tainted in the eyes of the High Lords. Not traitors, not loyalists, something in between, something infinitely more dangerous. The Lamenters, the Mantis Warriors, the Executioners. They had survived, but now they would be judged, and judgment in the Imperium was rarely just. The tribunal was held not on Terra, nor at any chapter keep or fortress monastery, but aboard a vast sanctified void station known only as Lex Talionis. Positioned above the scorched world of Orphedeus, it drifted in orbit like a black gavel suspended over a broken skull. The station had no windows, no balconies, only a single chamber, circular, cold, lined with vox scribes and steel-faced judges cloaked in the red of the Ordo Hereticus and the sigils of the High Lords. The presiding authority was Inquisitor Lord Veneris Otranto, a man whose reputation for iron interpretation of imperial law had made even the most hardened Astartes wary. Flanked by 4 canonical assassins and attended by hooded lex mechanics, Otranto's presence ensured that this was not a forum for discussion. It was a theater for sentencing. The executioners were summoned first. Only a single company had responded to the call, a silent force led by the grizzled Thulsa Cain, the very champion who had sworn an oath to the Astral Claws centuries before. His armor was unpolished, marked not by shame, but by decades of unflinching tradition. He did not kneel. Executioners never did. Otranto's accusations were precise: collusion with the Secessionist cause, breach of Codex protocol through the use of ritual executions, refusal to answer repeated summons from Segmentum Command during wartime, slaughter of Marines errant and howling griffins on Bellerophon's Fall and Cairo's Vale. Cain responded not with defiance but with a single statement, spoken in a voice like splitting stone. "We honored our blood oath. We struck at those who raised arms against our kin. If that is rebellion, then make your judgment and be swift." Otranto made no expression. The verdict was delivered within an hour. The executioners would be spared complete censure, but exiled on a penitent crusade, bound by ancient chains of honor to fight where none would go. No fortress, no homeworld, no rites of recruitment. They would wander the stars, redeeming their name in blood until the Imperium deemed their ledger clean. Some say Cain never left Lex Talionis, that he died in the holding cells, refusing the offer of disgraceful mercy. Others say he still leads his warriors from the shadows, hunting horrors beyond the edge of the Imperium. Neither version gives comfort. The Mantis warriors came next. Their chapter master, Sartak, had not been captured. His fate remained a mystery. The delegation that arrived in his name was led by Captain Huron Shen, a stoic, steel-eyed warrior who had lost an arm defending tranquility from the Carcharodans. He carried no weapons into the tribunal chamber, only the tattered remains of the chapter's homeworld banner, burned, stained, but still intact. The charges were similar: support of the Astral Claws, obstruction of Imperial operations, and direct engagement against loyalist chapters. But unlike the executioners, the Mantis warriors were framed as victims of circumstance, misled, manipulated, caught in a storm they did not ignite. Even so, no mercy was offered. They were sentenced to a century of crusade, their homeworld declared forfeit, their fleet assets reduced, and their chapter status placed in conditional reserve. They were not trusted, but neither were they cast out. They left the tribunal without speaking. It is said that as they departed, one of the Lex mechanics found a Mantis warrior insignia carved into the wall of their waiting cell, marked with the words, "We obeyed, and still we suffer." Last came the Lamenters, or what was left of them. Less than 80 battle brothers had survived the purge at Zarathustra's fall. Their once glorious golden armor had faded to pallid bronze, dulled by fire and sorrow. Their chapter master, Malakim Foros, was missing, presumed dead or taken during the Minotaurs' ambush. The officer who stood in his place was Brother Captain Haraniel, who looked less like a commander and more like a relic. Gaunt, hollow-eyed, grief made manifest. The chamber fell silent as he entered. No accusations were spoken for several minutes. Otranto, for all his cold logic, hesitated. Even he could feel it, the weight of tragedy that followed the lamenters like a cloak. Their sentence was already written: exile, far beyond the Imperium's outer veil, to the edge of the ghoul stars, where horror slept and warp tides ran wild. They were not told to return. They were not expected to survive. It was a sentence draped in parchment and sealed with wax, but it carried the same meaning it had for traitors throughout history: oblivion. Haraniel said nothing, but before he left, he placed an offering at the foot of the tribunal dais, a single pristine blood drop pendant. Sanguineous symbol, untarnished. The parchment beside it read, "We bleed, so others remember." After the trials, the chamber was sealed, the data logs redacted, the records scrubbed. The Imperium would speak of victory, not justice, of loyalty, not consequence, of order restored, not of brothers cast into the void. Only those who were there would remember, and they would never forget. Karabkul never spoke publicly of the trials. He returned to the Red Scorpion's stronghold in the Zeist sector, where he spent a decade rebuilding what had been lost. But those close to him reported that he no longer led campaigns with the same fire. He had seen too much, not just the war, but what the war did after. In the years that followed, whispers began to circulate of executioners appearing in far-flung battle zones, arriving unbidden, cutting down alien warlords and vanishing before any could thank them. Of Mantis warrior ships operating in dead zones, warning colonies of tyrannid hive spores and guiding evacuations, of golden armored figures spotted on warp-torn outposts, rescuing pilgrims and vanishing before their names could be recorded. No declarations, no banners, no glory. Just duty, carried in silence, as if they were still fighting for the Imperium that had abandoned them, and perhaps, in some twisted way, that was the truest form of loyalty there ever was. The war was over. The Maelstrom still churned, and in the void, the shadows moved, not in hatred, but in mourning. The name Lufgt Huron had been scrubbed from Imperial records, struck from the sacred rolls of Adeptus Astartes' lineage, his chapter's banners torn down and burned in rituals of erasure. Statues of the Astral Claws were ground into dust and mixed into mortar for the fortresses of penitent chapters. On parchment, the war was closed. The Maelstrom had been pacified. Huron was dead. But the stars told a different truth. In the far reaches of the Maelstrom Zone, deep beyond the halo of Imperial surveyors and the edge of charted warp routes, something stirred. The void lanes that once lay dormant now boiled with untracked movement. Merchant convoys vanished. Watch stations went silent. Small Mechanicus outposts flickered out like guttering candles. And then came the raids. Not isolated acts of piracy, but calculated strikes. Military precision cloaked in anarchy. Entire supply convoys gutted and repurposed. Naval patrols destroyed without a trace. In each case, the attackers left a mark, burned into hulls, etched into stone, or embedded in the minds of astropath survivors. A red star, dripping, flanked by crude claw marks. The Red Corsairs had arrived, and at their head, broken yet unbowed, wearing a suit of blackened bladed armor fused to his ruined flesh, stood the warlord who had defied the Imperium and survived its wrath. Huron Blackheart, the tyrant reborn. His escape from Badab Primaris had been a death sentence in motion. When the Palace of Thorns collapsed, Huron's body had been caught in the Cataclysm's final shockwave. His command throne crushed, his left side pulverized, his organs exposed to flame and pressure. Few mortals could have endured it. But Huron was no mortal. His will refused to die. Battered, crippled, he was dragged from the rubble by a cabal of surviving Astral Claws, now nameless, their sigils removed, calling themselves only the Black Brethren. Loyal to the tyrant above all else, they carried him across a planet that no longer resembled anything but ruin. Huron faded in and out of consciousness, whispering orders even as his lungs bled vapor. They reached the last functioning void craft, hidden beneath the crust in a buried vault. One final blade hidden beneath the throne. They escaped into the warp on a shattered frigate, held together by machine oaths and raw hatred. It was then that the transformation began. Some say it was the warp that preserved him. Others whisper that the dark mechanicum, still lurking in the shadowed lanes of the Maelstrom, found him first, offering their grim craft in exchange for loyalty he never intended to give. Whatever the truth, when Huron next stepped from the shadows, he was no longer the noble warlord of the Astral Claws. His left arm was gone, replaced by a massive mechanical power claw, barbed and lined with plasma vents, capable of crushing Astartes' power armor like paper. His spine had been entirely reconstructed. His face, burned and torn from its bone, was hidden beneath a new helm, crafted from obsidian and ceramite, with breathing vents that howled like turbines when he moved. His voice, once charismatic and commanding, was now filtered through layers of synthetic growl. He no longer walked. He hunted. The remnants of the Astral Claws, now nameless, rallied around him. But Huron wanted more than survival. He had not endured for revenge. He had endured to reshape the war. He declared that there would be no more oaths to Terra, no more false loyalties to a throne that did not answer, no more codex, no more orders, no more shame, only strength. The Red Corsairs were born, a new brotherhood, not of shared gene seed or primarch, but of shared betrayal. Warriors who had been cast out, shamed, exiled, or broken by the Imperium. Rogue Astartes from shattered chapters, renegade guard commanders, even wayward Mechanicus heretics drawn by the magnetic pull of Huron's will. They came not to build a new Imperium. They came to make the old one bleed. Under Huron's guidance, the Maelstrom was transformed. What had once been a chaotic, storm-racked region became a kingdom of exiles. He seized Gor Daka, an orc-infested fortress asteroid, and repurposed it as a war factory. He hunted and enslaved rogue trader houses and used their resources to map hidden routes between warp tides. He recruited pirates, psychics, mutants, then broke them into a chain of command more ruthless than any chapter hierarchy. Soon, the Red Corsairs controlled entire sectors. And then they struck, not with crusades, with surgical brutality. In the sorrow of Banish, they lured an entire battle fleet into a fake distress call, then detonated a hollowed-out moon, obliterating 9 capital ships and capturing the gene seed of 3 successor chapters. In the raid on Vortim Reach, they stole a cache of STC weapon templates and left the station crew flayed and crucified in zero gravity. They even breached Watch Station Arithma, an inquisitorial stronghold once thought unassailable. The Ordo Xenos never released what was taken, only that every record of the attack was sealed and declared Hereticus level classified. And each time the Imperium responded slower, more uncertain, because the Red Corsairs were not chaos. They were not monsters, not madmen. They were wounded gods striking with the memory of loyalty scorned. Huron became more than a pirate king. He became a symbol, to some a dark messiah, proof that the Emperor's betrayal could be answered with power. To others, a horror of what a Primarch-like mind could do when stripped of chains. But he never declared himself a demon prince. He never knelt to any chaos god. He did not paint his ships in runes or drape himself in flesh. He still wore the blackened claw of the Astral Claws sigil on his chest, still called himself Chapter Master, still spoke of order. Even in madness, he remembered who he had been. When the Inquisition finally addressed the High Lords of Terra about Huron's survival, the response was muted. Too much had been lost in the Badab War, too many reputations burned. To acknowledge Huron's continued existence was to acknowledge that the Imperium had failed, not by being too weak, but by being too cold. So the Lord said nothing, and in the void the Red Corsairs grew. Carab Colin, aged and battle-weary, once confided to his apothecary upon reading a report of a Red Corsair raid on a Raven Guard outpost. "I thought we killed him in the fire, but I was wrong. He didn't die in the fire. He became it. And so the Badab War did not end in fire. It became fire, a slow-burning insurgency stretching across decades, a whisper of vengeance that echoed every time a loyalist ship vanished without a trace, every time a traitor banner was found hanging in an Imperial cathedral, every time a chapter answered a call and found only corpses, and a red star carved into the walls. The Tyrant of Badab was gone, but Huron Blackheart remained, and in the void between stars where betrayal lives and loyalty dies, he waits still, not for forgiveness, not for peace, but for the moment when the Imperium forgets to guard its wounds, so he can tear them open again,